Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Bounty episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z, and this will be our last Bounty episode before we go on our summer break, and we'll return from that on September 25th and 26th. While the podcast will be on pause, we'll still be around on Discord and whatnot. We'll also be heading to DEF CON. If you haven't heard the spiel already, we are planning to do some Spot the Vuln shirts and whatnot, so if you have any thoughts on that, leave them in our Discord. We are planning to head to DEF CON, and also we might do some other supplementary content over the summer, just not the regularly scheduled podcasts.
And I maybe should have brought this up before the episode, before I try and drop it on you. But I believe you're heading off to a conference here fairly soon. I don't know if you want to mention that to anybody who might be to meet you there or not.
Yeah, so I'm also going to Hardware I/O. That's at the end of this month. Technically beginning of June, because I think the conference starts like June 2nd to June 3rd or something like that. So I am going to be heading to Hardware I/O. So if anyone's heading to that, feel free to hit me up. I might be giving a talk there as well. I don't think that's been confirmed yet, but it seems likely that I'll be giving a talk there. So yeah, also check that out if you're heading to Hardware I/O. So yeah, that's pretty much what the summer is going to look like. It's going to be a little bit more packed than some of the past summers. This is the first DEF CON I think both of us are going to be going to since before the lockdowns and everything.
It's been a while for me since DEF CON. I feel like it was 2018 or 19 when I last went.
I think 2019 was when we both went. Last time we both went.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a good while, so I mean, there'll be that. I'm hoping to put out some other content. I know we say that like every summer break that we'd like to put out other content. But I would genuinely like to. I've had a couple people mention the idea of doing like shorts with the Spot the Vuln, so I might try and make a few of those and put them out or something through the summer.
That would be fun.
But yeah, I'd like to try and get us out like with a bit more than just the podcast content, but we'll see how that goes.
As always, yeah.
And
I was just about to address this. Yeah, so Rudimal asked, will they have recordings if you do the talk? I believe they will, yeah. Usually the Hardware I/O, they do the recordings of the talks. And they're, if I remember correctly, they've come out pretty quickly too. At least last year's did. So yeah, I think that it'll be recorded. So yeah, with that out of the way, though, we'll jump into some of our topics. Up first, we have a KeePass password dumper that went up recently, and it's got a CVE, but it's kind of a silly bug. It requires like local access and everything, but yeah, I'll let Z get into it here.
Yeah, and whether or not it deserves a CVE has been somewhat discussion. So the core issue here I thought was a little bit interesting. So it's in the impacts like KeePass 2. This is not impacting KeePass X or KeePass XC. It is specifically a KeePass 2 bug, so the primarily Windows KeePass. And specifically where the bug is they create a custom text box for your password entry. So like entering your master password, although it is used in like password edit boxes and such. So while the vulnerability is mostly about getting the master password, it could happen with some other things as you're using the application too. But it's a secure text box EX. This text box, basically the way it ends up working, and it works a lot like you kind of expect. You type your password, you kind of see the last character that you typed for a little bit as an unencrypted character, or not unencrypted, but like unmasked. Now it usually shows like the dot characters. And so that's what the attack they're going for looks for. If you're able to dump the memory of KeePass, you can go through it and just scan for like the whatever the dot character is called. Because I'm not speaking of the period, but that large one. Kind of just scan for, I guess, a bullet point almost. Oh no, there is probably a better name for that character. But you would scan for that character and then the letter, and then in their example here, if you were typing in password, you would see that the dot A, dot S, dot S, and you would have all of these strings with that character in memory. So you can kind of exfil what the password was just by looking at what strings it created in the process of actually building up the block. I thought that was just kind of a fun little way of getting the information there. It sounds like this may not impact the default. Actually, you know what? Does .NET even .NET? I don't think provides a default password box, does it? I don't remember if it does
I'm trying
or
to
not.
remember.
I mean, obviously, if you're using a web app, you have that default password type, but I don't remember if .NET provides a masking option. So maybe that's why they built it, or maybe they built this before .NET implemented it, or kind of added that sort of thing in. I was going to make the comment, it doesn't sound like the native one is vulnerable to this, but it might just be the fact there is no native one to be vulnerable at all anyhow. But yeah, I thought it was kind of an interesting. The level of access is really high. This is a local attacker who is able to get a memory dump of your process. So I don't know. I feel like it's a fair, or at least a somewhat worthwhile consideration. The main attack scenario I'd really be thinking of, because my initial thought was, well, why would you do this if you could just keylog them? You've already got code execution on the machine. You keylog as they're entering the password. You're getting the password. Why does this matter? Why do they need to take that degree of defense? Although I will say, like, after further thought, at least this attack, like if somebody stole your device in an unlocked situation, all this takes is a memory dump after the fact. So there is that little bit of extra attack surface that does come from this. So it is something to at least be considered, being able to dump things out of memory. And I'm sure they do take care to like not store the password after you've unlocked, or like after it's done the unlocking, to not keep that in memory. So it would make sense for them to also try and protect these strings in memory. Because it's like generally known, like you'd want to protect like your crypto keys in memory, and clearing the memory and stuff. So it makes sense to protect it here, even though the attack does feel fairly unlikely. There is at least a little bit of a um of an impact from it, at least.
You can see a practical side to it. Yeah. And I was just refreshing my memory, looking it up on the .NET framework. So there isn't like a password specific text box, but the text box control does have a password character property that you can set. But I don't think it allows you to do like what they have here, where it'll reveal the last character briefly. I think it's just it'll mask it as you type it entirely. So that might be why they came up with their own custom field there. But yeah, I tried opening up Visual Studio to check it, and then I remembered it was Visual Studio, and I'd have to wait, 20 minutes. So
It's still
I just canceled that. Yeah, actually, I clicked on it like while you were talking a minute or two ago, and it still hasn't opened. So I'm not sure what the deal is. Well, I am sure what the deal is. It's Visual Studio, but yeah. So, but yeah, it's kind of a neat trick. Basically, like revealing the password one character at a time. It is interesting that it's like that easy, because like you said, you would kind of expect uh you know critical things like passwords and secrets like that to be protected in memory. But yeah, it does require like local access, so it's not something that's going to be able to hit a ton of people or something. It's going to be quite tailored, but you also don't need like code execution exactly. So yeah, it's still kind of a cool attack.
I mean, I can't imagine a lot of scenarios where somebody does have a memory dump that doesn't have code execution. I suppose in the case of like a complete crash dump. So if you cause a crash, you can then do that and steal the device and get the crash dump file or something like that. But and Rudimal mentions that the Windows Presentation Foundation, WPF, like that. I want to say they introduced that with like all the Metro stuff and like I feel like that was when they introduced it, but like that presentation basically framework may have a password box.
Yeah, fair enough. I was talking about like Windows Form applications, so that's a fair distinction as well.
Yeah, which is what I think of by default too. But yeah, WPF does exist. Either way, like I don't have information on whether or not that implementation is also vulnerable in this way, because this does kind of make sense. Like if you're dealing with a dynamic string, you don't know how long it's going to be. So either you're going to allocate like a large string, or it's just going to you can assume it gets freed. And so it's just going to hang out in memory until it's overwritten. Unless you take that special case to actually go and clear the memory, which maybe by default they do now. Like, I definitely understand how this bug came about.
Yeah, it's not exactly something you're like a common attack scenario, I guess. to think about. So, yeah. All right, so getting into some other vulnerabilities, we have a post on two vulns in Jellyfin, which is a media server similar to Plex and Emby, but open source. It's actually forked from Emby. What they zoned in on here was the REST API in the server, which was implemented in ASP.NET. We have a lot of like Microsoft-based technology in topics today. And yeah, what they noticed was for authorization, they can be passed either via this custom XMB token header or the authorization header. And in a lot of locations, these values, like from these headers, were seem to be inherently trusted despite coming from the client. So getting into the first issue, which is a directory traversal, they looked at the log endpoint. Log upload endpoint, which is enabled by default. It ends up taking the client name and version to create the log uh, file path. Problem is, those ultimately come from the authorization header, which can be malicious, and you can path traverse outside the log directory. And the attacker also has full control over the file contents via the post body, so that's quite a significant primitive for an attacker to have. Though you are pretty limited by the fact that the file size is limited to 1 megabyte, and also you have the .log extension. You can't seem to get around that, which turned out to be a fairly significant limitation for them. They tried a few things, seeing if like maybe on Linux they could do something, because like the Jellyfin Docker containers ran as root. They wanted to see if maybe they could make a cron job, but cron job files can't contain dots, so they couldn't really find a way to chain that on its own to get something interesting. So they ended up finding another vulnerability, which was it stored XSS in the devices page of the admin panel. Again, similar story. Values from the authorization header were echoed there. I think the device ID is what they call out in particular. Furthermore, inline scripts were allowed by the CSP. So yeah, it was just a pretty straightforward XSS, and you could use a val with the classic string from char code character trick to evaluate code, because they couldn't seem to pass quotations through the authorization header, but yeah, with the string from char code trick, got around that. From there, to get RCE, they leveraged the media encoder, which would try to validate provided paths. And it would do that by like starting the path provided as a process. So by just using the log endpoint to upload a log file with arbitrary content, they could use the second bug to point the media encoder to that file, get it executed for code execution. And since it was in the validation phase, it also wouldn't replace the legitimate media encoder. So it was also somewhat, it had a bit of like a stealth aspect at that point. So yeah, from there the post talks about deploying an implant. I'll skip over that mostly here. It just involves like installing a malicious plugin. Might be interesting to you if you're interested in like Jellyfin specifically, but that's kind of where the vulnerability and exploit details end. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting way of chaining the two bugs. Although the way they use the first bug isn't the way that, like, they're not really abusing the path traversal, more just the ability to get arbitrary file content on the system, which still is pretty powerful.
And push it
But
into
yeah,
a known location.
Yeah.
Which is where, in some setups, you may actually abuse the directory traversal to like move yourself into root and upload into temp or something. It's like somewhere known.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
So that was quite an interesting chain with how it worked. But
it's a fun
the
chain.
bones were pretty simple.
I like the logging endpoints, the headers. It's logging is one of those areas. So this sort of logging is a little bit different than like your generic logging endpoint, but logging is one of those areas I think often gets overlooked in terms of security. Like, oh, what's somebody going to do with a log injection? But especially, I don't think, or I don't know if MB's or Jellyfin, sorry, is doing it here, but like, especially applications with more structured logging, like, there are those second order attacks you can go for now. So it's always fun to kind of see something involving the logging. In this case, it is a bit more trivial. It's just logging up our endpoint just takes the whole body and directory traversal. So it's not quite a complex logging bug, but it does remind me of that, and just, to take a look at that logging functionality, because it is really easy to kind of skip over and just kind of ignore as not interesting because it doesn't necessarily do very much, and not actually explore that functionality much further. On the whole, yeah, they got like their full RC chain outfit, so full compromise is always fun to see in the full chain. I don't know if we want to discuss this too much, but one of the sentences here right at the top, I I at least want to touch on briefly. I always thought, and I'm quoting at this point, I always thought of getting a CVE as information security's rite of passage, which is probably shallow reasoning, but symbolic value can't be denied. Honestly, I feel like CVs are overvalued. I don't even want to say overvalued. Like, I think people have the wrong understanding about like what having a CVE means, because get a CVE. Well, I mean, we just talked about the memory password disclosure thing. Like, you get a CV for something like that, and that's equivalent to your RC and something else. And you get a CV for like the random XSS in the WordPress plugin nobody ever uses. Like, it's all the same. So I feel like a lot of people kind of look at CVs like, oh, you have a CV, it means something, but in practice they just don't, unless you actually take the time to look at the CV and understand what the bug was. Just, I don't know, I've seen people kind of taking that view of like, having a CV is the rite of passage. I just don't really agree with that view. That like this,
I think that view has been fading a little bit over the years, because I feel like back when I was first getting interested in security, so like 2015, 2016, I feel like CVEs were made a way bigger deal than they are now, especially as, I mean, we've had a few episodes that have touched on like meme CVEs where like the bugs aren't even real, but they're assigned CVEs because, whoever reported it just did enough badgering and whatever. I feel like people have kind of come around to the fact that CVEs on their own don't really mean much. But I guess not everyone will share that opinion. And on some level, CVEs do provide value. I'm not saying we should just like scrap them or something, but yeah,
CVEs are still important for tracking the bugs if they exist within a network. Like, they have their use case. But it's only for tracking the fact that something exists. It tells you nothing about the quality of the bug or anything of that sort.
Yeah.
And actually, I think part of the falling out of them has also been kind of the rise of bug bounties. Because a lot of bug bounties, you don't get a CVE because CVEs are for tracking things that you can deploy. So, like my network, I might be running this application. So, a vulnerability in Google, I am not running Google in my home network. Like, that's not a application with a version I can just deploy locally or something. That is purely in one place. So those sorts of things don't get CVs. They don't get tracked like that at all because they're off in their one place, not being deployed, not being shared, and thus not needing any sort of tracking of this sort. So like finding some great bugs in whatever web application that isn't self-hostable doesn't get you a CV, but it's still a solid bug to find. So I feel like bug bounties have probably had a hand in drawing people away from going for CVs.
That's a fair point. I didn't really think about that, but I like it. Maybe we'll circle back to that a little bit on a later topic, actually. But yeah, in terms of the Jellyfin post, two vulnerabilities chained together, kind of interesting way. And I was just going to back up what you said about the logging stuff too. It is one of those functionalities where it's easy to skip over, especially if there's not an immediate vulnerability to take advantage of. Like in this case, there kind of was. But just in general, like being able to upload file contents or get file contents on a target system is a pretty nice primitive, even if it doesn't immediately lead to anything. It can be very nice to have in the toolbox for when you do find something more significant that you can exploit. So yeah, let's get into a post by Trustwave. And it's kind of a fun post on a TOCTOU in an undisclosed game that has magic and spells, hence the title Harry Potter style, though they state it's not a Harry Potter game. So, yeah, like I said, this is more of a fun post than anything. It tells a bit of background about the game, which has a classic mechanic of MMOs. When you're on the road or between keeps or whatever, you can attack and be attacked by other players, get robbed, etc. But when you're inside settlements and keeps, you're in a safe zone where weapons can't be used, or at least that's the intent. And it'll do that by doing a location check against the player whenever they try to perform an ability or something. The problem in this particular game is that these spells are like a cast spell, so they're not instant. You first have to, target a player and then it casts. So if you can cast a spell, leave it hanging there, and then go into some safe zone to target, you can bypass the safe zone mechanic and hit the player in the safe zone. So that's where they talk about time of check, time of use here. This particular game had that issue. They were able to cause that hang and kill players inside of towns and whatever. Or I think what they say in here is like turn them into a frog or whatever. But yeah, I mean, there's not really a ton here in terms of technical detail. It's just kind of explaining TOCTOU and giving a nice, or a fun example of it. But still, like, we like to talk about how bugs can impact games sometimes on the show, and I thought this was a nice, like, post of levity for people who might want a quick read that's not too heavy or anything.
And it's a really good illustration of TOCTOU attacks and just how that whole concept of time check time versus time of use issues. I think it just does a really good job of illustrating, that separation between those two events. It sometimes can be a little bit unclear when we're talking about and trying to give examples of it. Because oftentimes when I talk about using examples, like, I often rely back on the CTF example, incrementing points, where, if you have multiple threads all incrementing at the same time, you can have an issue, which I guess I guess that's more of my race condition illustration rather than specifically TOCTOU. But yeah, I don't know. I thought it was a good just example of that class of attack that, like, is a lot easier to understand than I think a lot of examples are.
Yeah, and it's got some flashiness to it because, like, these kinds of bugs are what people like to try to find and exploit in games, even if they're not in the security sphere. Which I think is another thing this post does well. Is, the CTF example is fun to talk about, but if you're not in security, you're going to be like, you probably won't really grasp the implications of it. Whereas, something like this, you kind of grasp it right away, especially if you've ever played like an MMO with this sort of mechanic in it. So. Yeah, I thought it was a fun post to give a quick highlight to. Getting into a more serious issue, from Yas Senchity, we have a loophole in renting luxury cars. So yeah, basically like a price manipulation type bug. Z, I'll let you get into this one.
Price manipulation, also a crypto misuse, perhaps. What they had here, it's a fairly straightforward issue. They were able to rent luxury cars for $1, which sounds great. The loophole here that they kind of leveraged was in making the request to rent a car. It would pass in these, they refer to, encoded strings. So just these blobs of data that they couldn't figure out, what the actual content was. It just gets passed in there. So what they ended up trying was just taking, what if they took that blob from a cheap vehicle and just kind of replayed it or inserted it into trying to rent a more expensive vehicle? And what they found was that impacted the price. They were able to rent the more expensive vehicle, but by using the blob from a cheaper vehicle, it would basically give you the price of the cheaper vehicle. So getting the rental for 1 INR. And that feels a lot like one of your kind of classic crypto issues where you're using encrypted values, but you're not associating them with anything, or you don't have it. Say again?
Replay attacks, basically, yeah. It's what it boils down to.
Kind of, but I don't think they're intending to prevent you from being able to replay these values. It's using the wrong value with the wrong parameter set. Rather than replaying it. Like, I did use the term replaying in terms of taking the value from one and using it against the other, but I do see a distinction between a replay attack, which I usually see as just replaying the same action multiple times, and this one where you're taking data from a separate action, using it in the wrong action. So I do see a distinction there. I can maybe see what you mean with the replay. My thought is, like, there should be something that associates the string with the data it's supposed to be. So if it is a price, we don't actually know what all is in the blob, but let's say it is an encrypted price, it should probably also include like the car ID or something. So it would be an ID plus the price together. So if you pass the wrong thing, it has a way of kind of detecting that and, can reject it. It is a kind of classic crypto issue where the crypto is being used, and it can be used, like the crypto itself can be secure, but the crypto system around it isn't secure because it isn't handling these other attacks. So yeah, I thought it was just a fun little bug on that front. Not a crazy bug here. It's not that difficult to understand. It is just reusing that value, but we don't get to talk too much about crypto in a really accessible way, and this is a pretty accessible or understandable crypto bug.
Yeah, it's another example of how you can break crypto systems even if you can't break the crypto itself. To be fair, like they don't say outright it's encrypted, they say encoded, but given the fact they weren't able to reverse the encoding, it's, it could be crypto.
What's the difference?
Hard to really say. Yeah, in effect, it's the same thing. So, yeah, it's just a reminder of like, even if you can't, like, even if you encrypt the data, actually like validating the integrity of it and making sure it's being used in the way it's intended is sort of its own set of problems that you have to handle.
Yeah, an interesting one with this is even if you did check the integrity, like the value can, like the integrity wasn't necessarily compromised of the encrypted data itself because it's being used somewhere else. So yeah, even doing integrity checking wouldn't necessarily protect you from this. And this is also, I guess, a place to kind of, go on the soapbox bit and mention, not rolling your own crypto systems. And that doesn't just mean not implementing like AES yourself, but not rolling out your own custom uses of crypto like this by using common framework. Yeah. You create a bunch of issues unless you really understand the depths of it.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into some shoutouts. So Pi3 put out a blog post on titled "Bug Bounties Are Broken: The Story of the i9-15 Bug, ChromeOS, and Intel Bounty Programs and Beyond." So the actual vulnerability in this post is like a binary type issue. It's in the Linux kernel, so we're not really going to cover it here. But on top of the vulnerability, it also goes into like a meta discussion on bug bounties, starting off with like the history of bug bounties and whatnot. And I thought it was kind of an interesting read, especially going into the history if you're not fully aware of the steps that led into bug bounties being where they are now. And it kind of goes on like a taking a balanced take on bug bounties of like what they offered, how they've benefited security over the years, but also how they've kind of over the last few years maybe fallen off a little bit, like we're kind of exiting the golden age, especially with a lot of the drama around bug bounties, which we've covered a few of the cases I think that are even mentioned in this post on the show before, like some of the Microsoft case examples. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting meta level take on bug bounties, which we like to talk about sometimes. Actually, one of the points is he has talked about, maybe not so much recently, but I remember at one point he talked about it quite a bit, was using bug bounties for income, and saying like maybe part of the problem that has cropped up with bug bounties is the fact that people are using it as an income source. So yeah, there's some interesting discussion in here. I think it is definitely worth the read, even if you're not interested in the Linux kernel or the vulnerabilities being talked about here. The first half of this blog post is pretty interesting, and I think it's worth a read if you're interested in like vuln research programs and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't think we want to go into like all the details about everything you raised because we have had this sort of discussion about some of the challenges with bug bounties. I do want to clarify, I don't like have an issue with people getting paid for bug bounties or using that as your income. But when it becomes your primary source of income, the dynamic changes from where it was just people were exploring on applications already and like doing that for free and then getting arrested or something, versus getting something, having a bug bounty, and like that movement of the industry towards actually accepting like they just want to report the bugs. They're not looking to hack, it's just, or like to maliciously hack. It's just reporting some bugs, and like that shift to now reporting those bugs can be a career move. I don't take issue with, but it has changed the dynamic between researcher and company. The way you kind of mentioned there maybe made it sound like I was like, yeah, people shouldn't be getting paid for bug bounties or something, and definitely not going that far on it. I will also say, so the history he asked ChatGPT for the history. I know I'm not sure how accurate this is. I'll put it that way. Um, or how much is missing. I mean, it is a very brief history here. It's like a paragraph, so it's not like it's going very deep. I remember a couple other companies from that time that seemed to be pretty early, although Netscape and Mozilla, I guess, could be the bigger names there. But yeah, I'm not sure about that. So take some of that with a grain of salt, being that is from ChatGPT. And I was going to add one thing into the problems list. They kind of have 7 problems here: insufficient rewards, slow, unresponsive communication, lack of transparency, unclear scope, duplicate reports, rejecting reports, and no public recognition. Another issue I think that kind of exists, and it's maybe touched on with no public recognition, but it's just the idea of knowledge sharing and actually sharing that widely so other people can learn, because oftentimes bug bounties are used as muzzles. We're not going to pay you unless you stay silent about this vulnerability. And I think
sort of
that
paying off for non-disclosure.
Yeah. I think that's another problem that doesn't get talked about here, but yeah. On the whole, like, I thought it was an interesting read that people can check out if they're interested in it, but it is just it is probably a lot of what you've seen before in terms of bug bounties. It is interesting to be covering Pi 3 on the bounty episode instead of binary, though.
For sure, it might be the first time. But yeah, I think where this post could offer a lot of value is if you are looking to get into bug bounties, or if you know somebody who is. I think this post would serve as like a pretty decent summary of what the potential problems are, what you might have to deal with, and how the power dynamic works, especially in the cases like Z mentioned earlier, where if you're relying on it for income, the power kind of shifts pretty heavily in favor of the company, because if the company just decides to not accept your report or not pay you for it or pay you less than you think it should be worth, there's not really many courses. There's really not any recourses for you to take, because you're kind of at liberty of what they decide. So yeah, just some things to be aware of there.
You're at the mercy of the people who made that decision to appeal it to them and ask them to change their mind, or you go to social media. Like, that's really the 2 options.
You bring out the pitchfork mob. Yep.
Yeah. Touches on, this is a quote from him. Moreover, there's a lot of false and misleading advertising. This is like about bug bounties as an option. All of these articles showing the $1 million bug hunters, giving the impression that you too can become rich when you do bounties. That is, like, I feel like it's a somewhat common attitude among those who do bug bounties, as like their kind of career, as their primary source of income, is, well, if I could do it, anybody could. And I feel like there's a lot of people who just fail, who just don't have, like, there is luck involved with bug bounties. There is the aspect of, not only do you have to be, like, on any given application, you have to be looking for the correct bug. Like, you can look for all the SQL injection you want on a website. If they're not even using SQL, you're never going to find that bug. So there is a bit of luck on just what you choose to look for and where you choose to look. I mean, that's a very kind of high level thing. You might be able to determine good aspects or good places to look. But there's a lot of luck. There's the luck on, has somebody else reported this before you, dealing with the dupes. I think, like, people can absolutely make it as a career in bug bounty. It's just, I don't think it's purely, I worked harder than those other people, and those other people who failed just aren't working hard enough, which is a sentiment I get a lot from bug bounty hunters. It just takes hard work. And no recognition.
And luck is a big factor.
Yeah, of the rest of it. And don't get me wrong, like, after some time, like, especially if you have some sort of backing, so you can build up kind of a runway, that luck becomes less important. But getting there in the first place, I don't think is purely a hard work thing. That is, I think, a separate discussion, though. That's not even really coming up here. Or, well, it comes up in just this one paragraph.
Yeah, it's just kind of a brief excerpt. But yeah, I think that there was some good points raised in here, and I think it's a pretty fair take. Like it's not fully ranting on bug bounty programs. So when it gets specific to his case, it gets a little bit more personal, I guess. But especially like the first half of the post, it's a pretty balanced take. So yeah, I think it's worth shutting out.
Yeah.
So like I said at the top of the episode, this will be our last bounty episode for the summer. And one thing we do like to do on the show is put out some resources for anybody who might be interested in, finding some stuff to read while we're away, while we won't be covering stuff. So Z has put together some shout outs that I'll let him get into here, and then we'll wrap up the show.
Yeah, and I'm kind of going to do this as a bit of a rapid fire, just a bunch of resources for those of you while we're gone. If you want something either to listen to, there are a few podcasts that I'll give mention to. One is Critical Thinking, Bug Bounty Podcast. We've mentioned them on the show before. I don't believe they actually have a website, so I'm just linking off to their Twitter, which gives you a link off to their Spotify and wherever else. A bit more discussional than what we do, but they will cover recent vulnerabilities. They will go more into actually hunting for some of the bugs, some of the process methodology, tooling, things like that, specifically around bug bounty and bug bounty style issues, which if you're listening to this particular episode, it's probably in line with what you'd be interested in. Solid podcasts all around. They're fairly new. I've enjoyed listening to them. I think I want to say they're at like 17 episodes. I don't see a number here, but yeah, worth checking out. Absolute AppSec is one I've started listening to relatively recently. Absolute AppSec, the title kind of gives away application security. It's a couple of security professionals working more on that security engineering AppSec side of things rather than pen testers or bug bounty hunters. So it is a very different perspective, but they are industry professionals. Tons of experience there. They talk a lot about code review. They do get into tooling. They do get into some of the more practical sides of running an AppSec team or of being on an AppSec team. I think both of them are at the manager level or above. Like they've been in the industry for a good while. So there tends to be a lot of insight in there out of kind of what they're talking about and stuff. Again, it is more discussional than what we do. They're not like diving into vulnerabilities every week. On that discussional side, Open Source Security Podcast. Again, very much more discussional. I go back and forth on actually liking their episodes, in fairness. Generally speaking, I enjoy their discussions. They'll have a few more arguments than I think Spectre and I do, as we tend to kind of have similar backgrounds and in agreement on a lot of things. They'll go back and forth a bit more a lot of the time. Other times it's just really talking about their experiences. So those are kind of three podcasts you can listen to. I mean, while we're gone and when we're back, I'm sure you can keep listening to them. This isn't a zero-sum game. But definitely worth checking out if you haven't heard of any of them before. In terms of finding write-ups and just getting kind of interesting links, there's the AppSec eZine, which I don't know if they release this in another way. I just follow their commit feed on GitHub to get like the episodes when they come, or issues when they come out. But they'll have a lot of the links that we end up covering. So they'll have the Vuln write-ups. They'll have a bit more on some red teaming stuff, tooling. They'll have more on POCs and kind of a fun section, which just random kind of technical stuff that isn't necessarily security related, but is tangent, is probably of interest to people. I even take a look at them sometimes to see if I've missed any interesting topics for the week. On a similar note, Bad Sector Labs, they do another kind of weekly thing. So I think their last one was, looks like it's been about 2 weeks. But last week in security, very similar. Different. They just collate a bunch of the posts and stuff that came out, their techniques and write-ups, gain a bunch of the write-ups. So a lot of similar links, a lot of similar things and content that's new to them. Yeah, again, it's a weekly thing. Just keep your eye on. Maxwell Dolan, talked about him before, recommended this last year too. He does little write-ups about vulnerabilities, so similar to our Vuln summary write-ups. Lately it's been a lot of the crypto or cryptocurrency bugs. But yeah, does good summaries of them. And keep an eye on. He's also got a blog to check out if you want that, but good resource for kind of summaries of things too. Pen Tester Land write-ups. Don't worry, if you're getting tired here, I'm almost done. Pen Tester Land, they do write-ups, so bug bounty write-ups mostly every week. Well, not even every week. Every so often, every few days, they just update this with all of the bug bounty write-ups that they've seen or that they have links to. I have a few tags on there, but generally it is just a link to all of these write-ups, so it's just somewhere to keep an eye on. See what's
another good aggregator to have.
Yeah. Like, they don't add anything to it, but I'll definitely find write-ups that I didn't see on like Reddit or something here. And speaking of Reddit, web security research, our web security research is definitely a good place to keep an eye out on. Not super active, but good content when somebody does post something there. NetSec, I assume most people are already familiar with NetSec, to be fair. I mean, you're probably not learning about our NetSec from our podcast. They're definitely a lot better known than we are, but that's there too as another source. I could say Twitter, but I don't actually follow Twitter for like security or for like the security news and stuff. So, or maybe people are on Mastodon now, but I don't really follow
comment on that a bit. Twitter generally is pretty good as long as you have the I want to let me get the name of the extension. Yeah, so if you have like control panel for Twitter, just so that you can disable some of the algorithm stuff, especially if you get around that, you can definitely get some nice feed out of Twitter if you follow the right people and whatnot. So, but it does kind of rely on you going out of your way to like tailor your feed by who you follow. So, it's not quite as effortless as a lot of the other aggregation sources you have here.
Yeah, so I mean, you're more than welcome to follow us. We don't post anything about self-promotional spam, so if you like that sort of thing. I mean, we do put out some other comments every so often on Twitter, but I'm not a very active Twitter user myself, so we don't end up getting, or we don't generally put out a ton, but a lot of the InfoSec industry is on Twitter, and like a lot of things do break on Twitter, so it is worth following. I just don't have good recommendations on that front. And I guess the last link I'll drop is, well, our self-promotion, being O-Day fans or zerodayfans.com, which basically is just an aggregator of a lot of the blogs that I follow as part of trying to get the podcast together. This aggregates several of them, adds a little bit of a filter on them to try to only get vulnerability reports. It's not perfect, because it is all automated. But generally speaking, it's going to mostly be vulnerability reports that come up on here. And there are several blogs on the side to check out if you're interested. But yeah, O-Day Fans is... I put a lot of work into getting it up there. I'm pretty happy with like the quality of the content that comes out of there. It's not necessarily the news, it's your vuln write-ups. Here's some interesting bugs to check out. Well, it doesn't know what's interesting or not.
I think at this point the curation is pretty good though. Unfortunately, our like feed or announcements channel that we have set up for O-Day fans has been like broken for a little bit.
You told me about that, and I forgot to fix it. Yeah, I think
we'll
the RSS
bot. The summer break.
Yeah, RSS bot died or moved or something. I just have to get that set up again. And then we'll have the announcements back in Discord. I just completely forgot, even after you told me about it.
Yeah, no worries. But just for people out there who do like follow that channel or have it in their servers or whatever, we'll try to get that working again. But yeah, I think O-Day fans is a pretty good like, obviously it's ours, so bias, but a fair number of the topics we cover also end up on Ode fans. I'll put it that way. So yeah,
Yeah,
and the theme is fun.
Yeah, as I keep finding blogs and stuff and finding good blogs, I use a feed reader called FeedBurner, I think it is. No, Comma Feed. FeedBurner is something else. But I use Comma Feed to kind of manage a ton of feeds. And as I find like a good blog and stuff, and if it is mostly vulnerabilities, I add that into this little category called good feeds under research. And then that automatically ends up in Ode fans. So as I improve my like search for topics, Ode fans improves with that also.
It's a nice feedback loop.
Yeah, and I will quickly mention there is this feeds.txt file, which is just all of the directly included feeds. So as I add new things, they kind of get added in here. There are some cases that don't get covered. It depends on how I'm adding them and what exactly is being covered. But it's a lot of the feeds that get checked. So even if they're not updating and you haven't seen them on Ode fans right now, the actual blog is here if you want to go right to the source and look for some interesting blogs to follow.
All right, so I believe that's all the resources that we wanted to shout out for while we were away. We do have one more episode. Yeah, we do have one more episode left. That'll be tomorrow for our binary topics. Until then, though, thanks everyone who tuned in. All the previous episodes can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more off Anchor. Discord and Twitter links are down below or in the chat. Like I said, we will still be active on Discord. Even though the podcast is on pause. And we'll be back tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific for binary topics, which is also where the Spot the Vuln solution will be covered. And we'll see you then.
And for those of you who won't be back, who won't be on for that episode, enjoy your summer.